social science around marine energy and economic uses of the marine environment. The first network event that we had in Orkney was a face-to-face event, and we had a workshop here, and there were some sort of really positive things came out of that. One was just establishing, first of all, a loose network, but we also got a paper out of it, which was published in Energy Policy, setting out an agenda for social science research around marine renewable energy. And there was one or two other collaborations I know that have happened and have spun out into papers as well. Last year we had a bit of a failed attempt at getting another physical meeting together. As usual, it was finding funders and so on. So what we resolved to do over this winter was have a series of 3 webinar events. So this is the first one. So we're kind of feeling our way a little bit with the technology, but hopefully it's going to work out all right. This first event is looking at sort of community benefits, community issues, and the second one is on consultation process, and this will be in a couple of weeks' time. And the third one, early in the new year, is marine spatial planning, is the theme. Now, what we're going to do today is that we have 2 speakers. First of all, myself, Sandy Kerr from Heriot University, but based in Orkney at the International Centre for Oil and Technology. Then we have Glenn Wright, who's at the Institute of Sustainable Development and International Relations in Paris. Glenn's also with the Australian National University. And then we've got Simon Jude, who's with the Centre of Environmental Risk and Futures at Cranfield. The structure, the plan is that we'll presentations about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have some quick questions after that are germane to the presentation, just pick up on any points of detail. We'll do the 3 presentations, and then the plan is to have try and see if we can have a sort of roundtable discussion. So before we get going, I'm going to pass back to Laura, who's going to explain about the technology and how it's going to work, and how we're going to manage that, particularly that discussion, try and get the interaction going. So Laura, unless you think I've forgotten anything, if I can pass over to you, that'd be great.
No, that's fine. Thanks very much, Sandy. So what I'm hoping that everyone can, those of you watching on the GoToMeeting viewer should be able to see me at this point, Simon and Sandy, and you should also be able to see there's a screen that's with just a slide saying ISSMER. And what's going to happen over the next little while is I'm going to make visible some of the technology that we need to do to kind of make this all work. If anyone has any technical problems at some point during the meeting, if they can drop me an email, I'm going to keep an eye on it. We also have Simon, who some of you have been liaising with, who's been helping in the background, our research assistant, who's also going to be available for the first half hour. So if you've got any issues, please drop us an email and we'll try and fix them as we go. Just to say what we're going to be doing in terms of the technology is that rather than having lots and lots of webcams, we're going to ask people who have webcams to switch them off for the majority of the time, so that we can just basically see the presenter and also the chair. And then I'm hoping everyone can see the GoToMeeting control panel, which everyone should be able to see. If you can't, there's a little orange arrow on your screen which will open it up. And in that control panel, there's a place for you to switch the webcam on, but also at the bottom, there's a little arrow which says chat. And if everyone can open that up, we're going to use the chat box for you to kind of raise a hand and to indicate that you'd like to ask a question, because obviously it's quite difficult. There's currently 14 of you online who are quietly listening. So what we'd like to do is, if you want to ask a question, just sort of indicate something in the box and say, you know, I've got a question, raise a hand. And Sandy and also Kate, I think, is in Orkney as well, is going to be monitoring that. And then they'll kind of field questions as and when. So that's the box to use if you want to ask a question to intervene. And then the other final thing I want to say was it would be really appreciated if you could also manage your mute button. Just because, you know, there could be background sounds and things, and if background sounds from 14 people might end up being quite a lot. So we're just going to manage that. And bear with us if we have any little switch over technical issues. We're recording this, I should say, which is quite important to note. I hope that's okay. If anyone does have any issues, please do get in touch. We're going to make that recording available on the ISSMER website. And the final thing to say technically is the fact there'll be some technical handoffs as we actually have to move the recording between presenters for reasons that aren't going to become clear right now. Thank you very much for your patience with a little technical briefing. Any questions, as I said, post them in the little chat box and we'll endeavour to answer them. So back over to you, Sandy.
Hi. Well, Laura, next thing on the agenda was to try and do a sort of introductions from everybody. So maybe you can talk us through the technology there, because I'm not sure how we're going to manage that. But
I propose that what we do for the round table, if everyone would like to take their microphones off mute so we can hear you, and then I suggest that, Sandy, you start at the top of the list of the attendees and invite people to introduce themselves, because we've got a list. And then people know when to speak.
I don't have the list in front of me, sorry.
No, I mean on the GoToMeeting control, or I can just invite people to introduce themselves. Shall I do that?
Yeah, if you could, that would be great.
Okay, so I'm going to switch off my webcam and then I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves in turn. Okay. So, Glenn Wright, if you want to briefly introduce yourself. And you need to take you're on mute at the moment. There we go.
Right, am I off mute now? Is that good? Yeah, cool. So I'm Glenn Wright. As Sandy said, I work for IDRI, which is the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. Nice, concise name, in Paris. But I'm also doing my PhD at the Australian National University, and the topic I'm working on there is to do with legal issues around marine renewables, which is why I'm interested in ISSMER and the fantastic idea to have a webinar series. So yeah, looking forward to meeting everyone and having some good discussions. Cheers.
Thank you. Sandy, do you want to talk further about yourself?
Yeah, I'm just getting to grips with I can now see the attendees. Yes, my name is Sandy Kerr. I'm Director of the International Centre for Island Technology here in Orkney, part of Heriot-Watt University. We've got a big interest in renewable energy, marine renewable energy, but also islands and sustainable development issues on islands and small rural communities. A cross-disciplinary unit. My background is originally in economics, but I'm very interested in marine planning, where the money's going, community benefits, resolving conflicts. That's the kind of area that I'm interested in from a research point of view.
So hello everyone online. My name's Laura Watts. I'm an associate professor at the IT University of Copenhagen. And Sandy and I, and also Kate Johnson, who I don't believe is with us at the moment, who's also at Heriot-Watt. The three of us have been sort of trying to hold together the ISSMER, the International Network for Social Studies and Marine Energy. I've actually been doing ethnographic fieldwork in Orkney with the European Marine Energy Centre and with a lot of other activities happening in Orkney around marine energy and future making in the islands. So that's very much my involvement in the process, and I'm very much looking forward to talking with many of you here, because my background is as an ethnographer and also in the field of science and technology studies. So I'm interested in the social and technical practices and how both people and technology are making the future, particularly around marine energy. Thank you. So we have Simon, I think. Simon Jude.
Hello. Yep. Hello. Hope everyone can hear me. My name's Simon Jude. I'm a lecturer at Cranfield University in our Institute for Environmental Health, Risks and Futures. I've previously worked in the offshore wind industry, so you'll hear a little bit of my thoughts on that this afternoon. And I work on risk and decision making, so we've done a lot of work on risk frameworks, looking at how risk and uncertainty is being managed or not in the industry.
Thank you. Becky?
Hello, you can't see me because for some reason I don't have a webcam, but I'm Becky Ford. I'm a PhD student at the University of the Highlands and Islands, based at the Centre for Nordic Studies in Orkney. I'm also at the moment Laura's research assistant, and my PhD is looking at taking a dialogical approach to discourse community and marine renewables. So I'm looking at shared meaning making.
Laura, can I interrupt here?
Kate, yes, please.
For a second. Yeah, I'm here. I'm sitting quietly watching the chat box.
Okay. Could you introduce
Yeah, hi.
yourself, Kate, please?
Well, I was going to say this is going to take an awful long time, Laura. I just wonder whether we can keep this a bit shorter.
Thank you. Yes, Kate is, I should also say, that's entirely appropriate because you're timekeeping for us. So yes, I would encourage future people. I think it'd be nice if everyone did introduce themselves, but maybe if you could be a little bit briefer so we can keep the time. Apologies for us not setting a good example. Thank you. So I think on the list I have Booker, you're over next, I think.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. So my name is Bouke Wiersma. I'm a PhD student in Exeter in my final year. My PhD is looking at public acceptability of wave, tidal and offshore wind energy in Guernsey in the Channel Islands.
Fantastic, thank you. Carly.
Hi, I'm Carla McLaughlin. I'm a lecturer at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research in Manchester, and I'm interested in processes of consultation around marine renewables and how their impacts are interpreted differently by different communities.
Thank you. Glenn Smith?
Yeah, Glenn Smith. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Tromsø in northern Norway, and I'm studying issues related to marine spatial planning in Orkney, of which renewables obviously is a big part. Okay.
Thank you. John Colton, yes, please introduce yourself. John? John, are you there?
Yes, hello, it's John Colton. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just kind of figuring this stuff out. My name is John Colton. I'm at Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, and I work with the Acadia Tidal Energy Institute.
Cool. Thank you. Jordan?
That's me.
Yes.
Okay. I'm Jordan Carlson. I'm a master's student at Dalhousie looking at community scale tidal energy.
Thank you. Marcus?
Hello, everybody. My name is Marcus Lange. I'm currently based at the Beaufort Laboratory of the University College Cork in Ireland, and I'm working on the marine renewable energy decision-making, placing it into the context of coastal and ocean governance.
Cool. Thank you. Megan?
Hi, I'm Megan Swanberg. I'm also with the Acadia Tidal Energy Institute in Nova Scotia, Canada. And we're currently developing an online mapping initiative and looking at adding socioeconomic layers to it.
Thank you. And Jacqueline?
Hi, I'm Jackie Tweddle. I work at the University of Aberdeen and Marine Scotland Science. I'm a research fellow in marine spatial management.
Cool. Thank you very much, everyone. So that's 15 people that we have here. So what I'm going to do now is if you could also put yourself onto mute.
With the technology a little bit. Well, thanks everybody, and it's nice to see we've got such a range of people here. I think part of when we set up these sessions, we thought we'd try and sort of seize the short presentations and try and be a little bit controversial and introduce some sort of different ideas. So what I want to talk about is community benefits, but talk about discuss them in terms of sort of power relationships between communities and developers. If you look at the literature, community benefits tend to get lumped together as one thing, but actually when you look at community benefits in practice, they can be very different, and the power relationships between community and developer are very different. In fact, actually power relationships are incredibly important if you look at the history of energy going back over the years. I don't want to dwell on this, but actually power relationships have often, where power lies, have had more to do with how the energy sector is developed than cost-benefit analysis or any sort of rational decision-making process. And just, got some really sort of obvious examples from a UK context. If you go back to the 1970s, there was a definite sort of power struggle between the miners in the energy sector and the government. That's Ted Heath, if anybody recognises him on the right there. And the power was tipped very much in favour of the miners. There was a miners' strike in the They managed to get a 31% pay increase, and that government fell. So it shows how important these power relationships are. 10 years later, it had completely swapped around. The miners and Margaret Thatcher, and she managed to win when there was a miners' strike in the 1980s. And that power struggle actually defined the energy sector that we have today, and actually has been copied in many places around the world. We have a privatized energy sector, and it's this privatized energy sector within which marine energy exists. I should say that 1973 date, try and remember it from the previous slide, because we're going to come back to that date in a moment or two. Moving on into the 2000s, certainly in the UK, the sort of dominant power struggle from at the sort of high level in the energy sector is really between the big six energy companies that have got there on the right, that control something like 96% of our domestic supply of energy, and I think it's 85% of generation capacity is owned by 6 companies. It's not the sort of perfect free market that was visualized in the 1980s when that private sector was established. And on the other side, you know, Ofgem and politicians might like to sort of barrel thump, but they seem powerless really when they're pitted against the power of the big 6 in the free market and their ability to, or I should say their apparent ability to manipulate prices. So power relationships is what the kind of theme that I'm going to talk about, but within the context of marine renewable energy. So what about marine renewable energy? Well, I've got this slide here that says controversy in the Highlands, and I want to pick on a particular little case study at a place called Kyle, which is the narrows between the island of Skye and mainland Scotland there. And there's a proposal by a company set up called Sea Generation, but to use marine current turbines technology just for 4 turbines. So it's not, compared to offshore wind, for example, this is a very modest development, and very modest compared to the major tidal development that is now going forward in the Pentland Firth Orkney waters. The interesting thing about this development is it created a visceral reaction from the local people. And the local development trust said there that local people would be prepared to disrupt the building of the development if there are no benefits to the area. The Highland Council leader, an elected official, said he would support direct action against bi-coastal communities against this sort of exploitation. And the Development Trust also noted that currently there are no obligations to pay community benefits, and that none would be provided unless a precedent could be established. So are there precedents out there in the energy sector, in the in the renewable energy sector? Well, there are a number of precedents, but they tell different stories, and they tell different stories depending on the power relationship between the developer and the community. So the first precedent I want to take you back to, and this is why I said remember that date, 1973, but is to Shetland in the north of Scotland, and not renewable energy, but the oil industry. Oil has been discovered in the North Sea in the early 1970s, and it was first brought ashore in 1978. But it was in the North Sea, and the only practical place for it to come ashore was Shetland. Originally, the plans were for a £20 million terminal, which they thought would deliver about 300,000 barrels per day. They actually ended up spending 1.3 billion, and it peaked at over 1.2 million barrels per day. So a really huge development. But the key point it was the only point that pipeline could come ashore practically was in Lerwick. So what are the power relationships, and what happened there? Well, there was a cry from the sort of local community, a desire to sort of control the development as far as they can and get sort of economic benefit from it. And this was facilitated by an Act of Parliament, and an Act of Parliament that went through in 1973 called the Shetland County Council Act, and it gave extraordinary powers to the Shetland Islands over navigation and so on. but it also allowed them to retain some of the income from the development. MP pushing this bill through Parliament said that arrangements should be made for the retention in the islands of a fair share, remember that term, a fair share of the income which would arise from these oil discoveries. It's worth remembering at the time, 1973, we just had a government fall because of the coal crisis. The UK economy was in disarray. We desperately needed the money. And that gave Shetland Islanders leverage to get powers from the UK government. And those powers came in the form of compulsory purchase powers. So the Shetland Council bought the land on which the development, the oil terminal would be built, and they were able to get a rent from the oil company. So oil's mined offshore, it's extracted offshore, but there's a rent to the islanders because they have power. The balance of power was in their favour. So that's quite some time ago, 1973, but what about some more up-to-date and current examples? Well, there are, and there are renewable energy examples of dealing with community benefit. Offshore wind in the UK has taken off from its early beginnings in the late 1980s. We've now got almost 4,700 turbines, almost 8 megawatts of installed capacity, and there's a map showing the distribution of wind turbines through the UK. These developments are controversial. They impact on the public benefit, the public good locally. They contribute to the public good internationally because they're helping us resolve the climate change issue, and of course they create private benefit for the developers. But sometimes that international benefit gets forgotten, and it's the conflict is between the private benefit and the local public good. So what about sort of community benefit payments from onshore wind in the UK, or at least in Scotland, which has been in the vanguard of securing these benefits and also the vanguard of onshore development in the UK? Well, I have a list here on the left of Scottish local authorities and payments that these local authorities seek from onshore wind developers. So there is now accepted practice, let's put it that way. It's not a legal requirement, but there's an accepted practice of making payments.
Sandy, we've lost you.
Oh,
We're lost.
You're back.
I'm back, thanks. So we now have £5,000 per megawatt coming back into local community in Highland region. Now I have to stress this is not a legal requirement, and it's described as a goodwill payment, but the key is that these onshore developments require planning permission, and they require planning permission, or at least the acquiescence of these local authorities. So there is some power there. It's not a legal requirement, but basically these payments ease the planning process. So that's onshore wind. We do have a lot of offshore wind development in the UK. In fact, since 2008, the UK is now the leading leader in offshore development in the world. We've got over 1,000 turbines installed, and the map on the left shows the round 1, 2, and 3 installations, and about 4,000 megawatts of installed capacity in the UK, and plans for more. So I've described community benefits onshore, and what about for offshore wind? Well, if you look around these developments, here's a table here of projects from round 1 and round 2 developments. These are big projects, multiple megawatts. They're fairly far offshore, a number of kilometres offshore, but here are the sort of payments. Well, a number of them don't give any annual payments. They tend to be sort of one-off donations, a donation to a school or other sort of good causes, And where there are annual payments, they're in the order of 1,000 a megawatt, not 5,000 like onshore. So there's not the same level of payment. And the key here, of course, is that the local authorities or the local authority on land has no or limited influence in the planning process. So there's less power. So the payments are more, they really are more like goodwill payments. So there we've got a situation with offshore wind in the UK at the moment. Going back to Highland Council, you know, they've imposed 5,000 megawatts for onshore wind, and they're trying to seek the same for offshore developments. And here we've got a councillor saying they want to maximise benefit to the local area. But it remains to be seen whether they'll be able to get that, because there's no legal requirement, there's no muscle, the council has no muscle through the planning process, because offshore the planning process is determined by central government. So here's a picture of Orkney actually, and where the EMIC test site is. And but the point I want to make here is there's a wave energy developments, rather than offshore wind. Wave and tidal developments are much closer inshore, and actually it's wrong to think of them as, in some ways it's wrong to think of them as marine developments. They're developments that straddle the marine land divide, and in fact this the Aquamarine's oyster pumps high pressure water ashore, and the power takeoff is onshore, so they straddle the land sea divide, but the planning decisions made offshore happen sort of centrally. So we've got quite a complex situation. So how can communities gain power? Well, it's not 1973 in Shetland, and politics are very different. There is little appetite in the UK today to give compulsory purchase powers to local authorities, because we're much more interested in the market and market-driven solutions. However, there's been one very interesting development in Scotland in the shape of land reform. Land Reform Act in Scotland in 2003 gave local communities of less than 10,000 the right to buy land from large estates if it came up for sale. In fact, government money was made available to help facilitate these sales. And the island you have there is the island of Gia. It was bought by its local inhabitants, a development trust established, and many of these development trusts around Scotland have actually set up energy projects to sell wind energy into the grid and bring money back. The interesting possibility that it also delivers for marine energy is that the land now is, in some cases, is owned by the community. Marine energy developers have to come ashore close to the development for wave and tide. It's not like wind where they're many kilometres out, and that gives them power. There's power in the land and the possibility of extracting a rent for that access to that land, not the sea, access to the land from those developers. So it's interesting, and it is analogous to, in some ways, to Sullom Voe in Shetland in the 1970s. So I'm drawn to a sort of conclusion now. I've just got a couple of slides left, but to try and sort of pull this together. Well, the point is that with I'm still there, with community benefit schemes, they're not all the same. They're very different, depending on the power relationships. And you can see a table here. What is the motivation for giving the payment? Well, in some situations, it's essential for the development to go ahead if you need to rent that land. In some situations, it's more of a payment to smooth the planning process. And in other situations, it's more just PR, corporate sustainability, a nice thing to do. And where you are depends on the extent of community empowerment or community power. On the left, if the community has legal rights over resources, it can drive a bargain and get a fair share. On the right, the community has no power, so it just has to take what's offered. And we have examples. Offshore wind appears to be to the right, small payments. It's PR, it's done for PR purposes. In the middle, onshore wind payments are made to smooth the planning process, even if there's not a legal requirement. On the left, well, we've got Shetland Oil and Gas, but possibly marine renewables if this community right to buy can be brought into play. So that's the summary. And in the great tradition of academic presentations, I'll give a shameless plug for 2 papers that I've been involved in, but the thinking for this is presented across 2 papers, one I wrote with Kate, and looking at the Shetland experience in 2013 in marine policy, and one very new paper just published with Kate here, but John Colton and Glenn Wright, who are online, which has just been accepted in marine policy, looking at rights and ownership and impacts for Indigenous and local communities. So that's my presentation. Thanks for listening in, and if anybody's got any questions, just quick questions that are focused on this, we can quickly take them. So just be brave.
Are you there, Laura? Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Yes, that's fine. And if anyone's got any questions, then please, type something in the little text box to say, to raise your hand in some way, or and let us know.
But if you haven't just now, so I thought somebody said spoken. If you haven't just now, we can move on to the next presentation and try and pick it up in the discussion. And I think in the interest of time, we'll do that. So I hope that came across clear. I'm now going to sort of flip over to Glenn Wright, and Glenn's going to give his take on sort of community benefits. And if Laura, if you can do make the technical changeover, that would be tremendous.
Yeah, I'm just handing over the presentation.
I just leave it like this. Yeah, so I'm glad that we're short on time, because I have to say I've just come back from 2 weeks in Australia. I'm still very jet lagged, and I hadn't had much chance to think through this presentation, although I do find time at the end to plug the same paper that Sandy just mentioned. So you'll all have that on your computers downloaded by the end. So I'll try and pick up a bit on some of what Sandy was saying, particularly about rights and power and how these things interlink. My background is in law, so my interest in marine renewable energy comes from the legal perspective. And one of the issues that I've become increasingly interested in is how industrialization of the oceans, so including marine renewables, which is my focus, is changing the sort of legal landscape and the policy landscape of the oceans, and changing the way we view rights and ownership in those spaces. So what I'll do today is just very briefly give some background on how legal rights in the oceans work, how marine renewables is possibly changing some of that, and of course that's just one example, but you could also apply these things to aquaculture or any other sort of fixed activity in the marine environment. And then I will briefly just give an overview of the paper Sandy mentioned, which looked at Indigenous and small local communities in a number of different areas, looking at how all of these sort of issues come together, so rights, ownership, power, Indigenous issues as well, so all of that mixed into one, which turned out to be a very interesting paper, because we realized that there's a lot of complexity there, and it's not so simple as to just say who does and doesn't have the rights, but a complex mix of all sorts of things. So unfortunately, I couldn't find the button to present my present it like a slideshow, so you're going to have all the squiggly red lines, which I can't get rid of, but I hope nobody minds that. So the history of sort of rights in the sea is that historically we've had a long-standing principle of freedom of the seas and common ownership of marine resources, and that situation persists in most places today, such that private property rights, where one person or a company or one particular actor has a specific and exclusive right to a marine space or a resource, are very rare. There's some examples, usually these are sort of hangovers from old legal regimes, but there's very few places anywhere in the world really where you can find that private property rights are provided in marine spaces in the same way that they are on land. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, provides a sort of constitution of the oceans, it's often said, and this provides individual states with a legal basis to determine who can have rights in their marine spaces on the national level. So that's everything up to 200, no, everything up to 12 nautical miles, is it? The territorial sea, something like that. What that effectively means is that states can legislate to determine who has the rights and can sort of infringe on public rights, which I'll go into a little bit. And this has happened to some extent in the UK already with oil and gas, and perhaps in some other countries too. What has persisted as well is a public right to fishing and navigation. So traditionally, you know, these are the two major activities that go on in national waters and internationally indeed. And those rights have been pretty much preserved everywhere. So in the UK, you have a public right to fish, a public right to navigation. As we'll see, some of the rights to fishing become complex because actually with quota systems, sort of private rights or quasi-private rights in fishing have also developed. Navigation remains a public right, so any sort of exclusive occupation of a seabed space or of a part of the water column perhaps infringes on this public right. So that's where marine renewables come in. And then finally, as you see, we've got all sorts of new activities proposed, and this is driven by a sort of policy incentive. In Europe, we have what they call the Blue Growth Agenda. This actually emerged at the Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012, when the Pacific states started suggesting that we focus not only on the green economy, but also on a blue economy, suggesting that we can, you know, better exploit marine resources to drive economic growth. And Europe has really sort of taken this on and started to develop this. So marine renewables forms one of the key industries that they wish to develop. Aquaculture is also in the mix. And so I have this quote with all the red squiggly lines, which I often use, and I'll give you the reference to the paper at the end, but this sort of sums up what I see as this confluence of issues. So you have the rapidly developing ocean use, we have new discussions on sort of governance of the oceans, technology developing really quickly. And what we're starting to see is the emergence of a lot of discussions around ocean space that haven't really occurred before, you know, around regulation, around marine governance. As you see with marine spatial planning, we're now looking more at less single sector regulation and looking at how you actually bring all of these different industries, all of these different actors and the science and the policymakers all together to kind of have sort of logical and holistic decisions about ocean space. And rights sort of forms a part of that, because as we get more demand for exclusive use of ocean spaces, obviously the question of rights starts to become more and more important. Wave and tidal energy are particularly interesting in this regard for a number of reasons, but I mean they have very large spatial requirements. So potentially looking to the future when we have commercial scale arrays, assuming that comes to pass, we're looking at, you know, square kilometers worth of space potentially taken up by these devices. They're permanent or at least very long term. So of course the developers require that they will have a license or a right to develop this project over many years in a way that the permanence is there in a way that isn't there with fishing or navigation. And again, the same applies with aquaculture. You know, you have rather large space requirements near shore. So as Sandy was saying, you know, these devices are often very near shore. What's interesting here actually is that while for planning purposes it makes a lot of sense to begin integrating those two aspects, they are completely separate. And actually, because we don't have a long history of sort of rights and ownership of sea spaces that we do on land, the questions that arise are very, very different, despite the fact that the proximity between the two elements of the project is so close. So we do have this rather bizarre situation where two completely different legal regimes apply, both in terms of the planning and the process for getting a consent is obviously very different for land and offshore, but also the questions that brings up on land. The planning system is fairly well established. At sea, these questions are very new. So yeah. The fact that the marine renewables are visible, I recall some time ago thinking that there would not be so much community involvement or concern over these devices if they weren't visible, but actually a lot of them are. And then you have the exclusive occupation issue, which I sort of mentioned before, but that's that despite some suggestion that these devices could be integrated with other uses, so offshore wind or oil and gas or fishing, actually what I found during my research, which has involved interviewing a number of the companies that are developing these technologies or projects, is that for a whole range of reasons, these people would much rather keep occupation of that seabed space completely exclusive. They actually have very little interest for many reasons in integrating with other activities. It's just much simpler for them from a sort of risk and a project development perspective and an insurance perspective to keep that occupation exclusive. And so those rights to occupy and use the resources are sort of the foundation of their project development. It's the first thing that you're going to look for when you're developing a project is do I have a bit of seabed that I can put this on, and do I have access to the resource, and is that exclusive? The problem with that, of course, is, as I've just said, there's not usually private rights in marine spaces, and so when you have an exclusive occupation that shuts out all other public uses of the sea, what you start to get is something that looks very much like a private right to ocean space. And it's for that reason that marine renewables has the potential to really be a driver for new discussions or perhaps new models of governance of rights and ownership in sea spaces, because effectively it's privatizing this common good to some extent. So there's a potential there to conflict with the public rights to fishing and navigation, and some research has already been done on this. So far, the legislation doesn't really give us a fantastic base to see what will happen there when there's a large conflict. Of course, for the moment, there's not a huge amount of conflict with fishing and navigation, but that is likely to change. There's also going to be a conflict with any other private rights in marine spaces that may exist. So, as I mentioned before, there's these sort of traded quotas in fisheries that start to resemble sort of quasi-private rights, and of course, exclusive occupation by tidal turbines is going to affect that. Wave devices are going to affect that. And because those sort of fishing rights and other rights potentially are quasi-private and perhaps not well defined, with no hierarchy between the different kinds of rights, what you have is a very complex situation that will evolve where I would imagine that very few people know what trumps what, and of course the marine renewables are going to want their activity to trump everything else, but likewise other activities are going to want the same thing. And then finally, and perhaps one of the most interesting, which I'll come to in discussing the paper on Indigenous and community rights, is that there's a strong sense amongst many communities that they have rights to the ocean, particularly where there's a historic connection there. So the third kind of rights that marine renewables may come into conflict with are rights that are not actually legal at all, but are perceived to be there. And I think this comes from the fact that, you know, we often use, or the general public, I suppose, often uses rights in a way that lawyers wouldn't use rights. And likewise, in this presentation, I've used the term rights, where actually some other word like license or permission may be more correct. So the idea of rights sort of gives people power. You know, it gives people something to coalesce around. The idea that you have a right to a certain piece of land or something that you have a connection to. And that also feeds into what Sandy was saying with regard to the payment of community benefits. Sometimes it may be that there's not a legal obligation to pay community benefits, but the non-legal sort of social obligation to do so and the pressure and the expectation to do so is actually much stronger than any legal framework in any case. So we're yet to see whether that will emerge with marine renewables. It doesn't seem to have emerged so strongly with offshore wind, with the payments sort of being more one-off sort of PR gestures. But with marine renewables, you're sort of in that space between something on land and something very far offshore. So it will be interesting to see how strongly these non-legal rights will come to be in the future. And that links to the case study that we did with John and Kate and Sandy, looking at Indigenous communities and small communities in Scotland where there's proposals to develop marine renewable energy projects. So we have this lovely diagram that Sandy sort of created, which I think really sums up quite well the sort of pressures exerted by marine renewables on rights, which is that on the one hand you have this strong sort of impetus to develop the technology and the economy on this blue growth sort of mandate that we have. But then at the same time, you have these social and cultural drivers. So in the Indigenous context, you know, a strong sort of moral imperative to be returning certain spaces back to Indigenous communities, a lot of legal cases ongoing in many communities to make that a reality, and strong pressure internationally to do that as well. and in local communities. And again, the example Sandy gave of the right to buy land is a good example of sort of a move towards giving communities some sort of recognition. And what we found is that there's not really one thing that you could say about all of these communities. We studied Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Scotland. And all of the projects varied considerably, including at times even within one country. So it's really specific to the local context. Again, in New Zealand, we had a similar situation to this example in Scotland, where the sense that ownership of the sea was in community hands was so strong that people were threatening to take direct action against these companies trying to develop projects. Whereas in Australia, we saw an example of a developer working very, very early on with Indigenous communities, despite the fact that actually the seabed rights really are no seabed rights for Indigenous people or Indigenous communities in Australia. Despite that fact, the developers working very closely with these communities because they realize that what's important in those communities is that the community buys in, that they're willing to help out, that they see some benefit from it. But most of all, that the planning process isn't sort of halted by long legal battles over sort of trying to stop the project going ahead. And again, I think this leads into what Sandy was saying about the sort of power dynamics between developers and sort of the communities and whether they have rights or not. Obviously, a real legal right will be a very strong sort of indication that a community is going to have a lot more power. But in the Australian context, what we've seen, for example, is that even where there's not a legal right, a perceived right to the ocean space is almost as strong in some ways, because it actually forces or encourages these developers to engage really early on to try and work out how are we going to get a community benefit, but also how is the company going to benefit developing this project sort of in concert with those people rather than against them. Unfortunately, we found that the law doesn't really do much in this particular context to balance the different rights and interests. So I think in all of the case studies that we looked at, there's really not yet a defined sort of legal basis to distinguish between different kinds of rights, which ones are stronger. And ultimately, I'm not so sure that will ever come to pass, partly because I'm not sure that the rights in the marine environment will develop in the same way as on land, even if we do get sort of marine spatial planning that starts to look very similar to land-based planning. I think what's far more likely actually is that we're going to see more of this sort of collaborative approach between developers that realize they have to be giving some community benefit and to be recognizing the perceived rights of these communities. And I think that's going to be much more important actually than sort of strict legal recognition. So I look forward to having some discussion on that. There's really more questions than answers at the moment to sort of explore. I certainly haven't come up with any grand ideas about how legal systems or regulatory systems will sort of affect a new system of rights in the marine environment, and indeed it's a really big question itself. So marine renewables certainly throws up a lot of interesting questions in that particular area. If you do want to do a bit of further reading, the paper that I got the quote from, Oshirenko's paper, written almost 10 years ago now, or 8 years ago, is very interesting. So it sort of sets out this dilemma that we have, or this challenge that we have in developing the oceans in an industrial sort of fashion, but also recognizing that we have no real rights system to do that. So that's a very good beginning article. An article I just published as well in Marine Policy sort of looks at the different areas of marine governance that marine renewables touch on. And so rights and ownership is obviously discussed there. And then the paper from Sandy and the rest of us on the rights and ownership in marine spaces for Indigenous and local communities. So I'm sharing my screen, but unfortunately I don't think you can click on the links, but you can see those in the PDF that was sent around earlier on. So I hope that's it's not so controversial as Sandy suggested. If I'd known that controversy was invited, I may have gone on a different tack, but I think that shall do for now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Glenn. Yeah, I saw your piece in the Guardian website, which was pretty controversial. In Scotland, we've been in Paris, and now we're heading to Cranfield. So, Simon, over to you.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm going to take a slightly different tack. I'm going to discuss, throw up some questions regarding whether marine renewable energy is actually a community benefit or potentially a burden to communities. This is based on it's just some thoughts I've had recently. The last week or so has been particularly interesting in marine renewables, as I'll come on to towards the end. We're seeing companies going into administration and also being put up for sale. So are there some potential problems being stored up for local communities? So what I'm going to talk about, some of it is some thoughts I've had recently, thoughts that I've had when I visited Stromness over the last couple of years, and also some thoughts from the Response Project. So the Response Project has been looking at marine vertebrate interactions with wave and tidal energy devices, essentially looking at is there an effect caused by when you put these devices on the seabed. And I've been working with a range of marine vertebrate experts, acousticians, EMEC, those sort of people who've been doing real hardcore science out in the field, whereas I've been looking at what sort of risk does this pose for the industry. And as part of this, some things have come up around community benefits and the industry as well. So I'm going to bring those in. So it could be a bit of a hodgepodge, but hopefully it will stimulate some debate and raise some issues about where there are some really exciting opportunities for research that maybe as a group we should be exploiting. I'm going to talk mainly about Orkney and show some examples from Stromness. As we're probably aware, there's huge development potentially likely up in Orkney. Over the next few years, we're going to see up to 1.6 gigawatts of energy, which at the moment equates to probably around 1,600 individual devices. In the response work, when I've been interviewing developers, device manufacturers, regulators, seabed lessors, everyone tells me that arrays are imminent, and you can see on this graph that we're going from literally no installed capacity in 2013 up to hundreds of devices by 2019. Whether this will actually happen, I'm a little bit skeptical. So will we actually see this smooth, rapid expansion, and what sort of benefits will we get for communities? And this is particularly interesting given the last few days. So I'm going to be a bit, maybe a bit controversial. I'd argue that a lot of the benefits, economic benefits with this huge growth, will actually flow straight out of bypass these communities. The vessel on the screen belonged to a company that I worked for that was involved in installing the array and export cables for offshore wind farms. It was a Norwegian company with offices in Holland, the UK, Aberdeen, Germany in the main markets. And really, it was these sort of contractors are going to take the big contracts within the developments that are being proposed. And a good example of this is the Sheringham Shoal offshore wind farm in Norfolk. It's owned by Statoil. It was installed by foreign companies. Most of the money went overseas. Actually, if you go into the community, there's only one very small project office in the town of Wells next to sea, and there's been very little investment, with the local council being very concerned that the economic benefits are bypassing these small communities. That said, there are some local developers. A good example here is up in Orkney, where you've got Scott Renewables, who are a very small local business trying to keep hold of the investment and keep control of the company, whereas a lot. Oops, hang on a minute. Okay, whereas a lot of the other companies over the last couple of years have been bought out by overseas companies, so the likes of ABB, Siemens, Alstom. So again, moving the potential economic benefits away from the local communities. However, do get stimulation of small businesses. Here's the example of Stromness. Sandy will recognise the building well, so that you've got the old Academy Business Centre. It's pretty full to the brim with lots of small consultancies, SMEs, startups, support services. So there are potential benefits to places like Stromness, but in my view it's going to be the smaller operational maintenance and management side of things. And this similarly has happened again in North Norfolk and East Anglia, where a lot of the main project investment has gone elsewhere. If we, one of the things that struck me about Stromness, I've visited a couple of times over the last two or 3 years, is the rapid growth in development in Stromness. So this housing estate that was being built when I was there last year is probably even bigger. You've got big influx of new employees for the wave tidal energy sector who are all wanting to buy new houses, potentially having the negative effect of pushing local people out of being able to afford houses. And also you'll get in the industry, particularly in the bigger contractors, very migratory workforce. So when it comes to the big installation, you might get people flying in because you get quite a nomadic kind of staff in the offshore industry. Stromness has potentially benefited from new community facilities. So there was a new school that had opened last time I went there. It'd be very interesting to talk to Sandy to see whether that school was needed due to the growth that might be linked to offshore marine renewables, or whether actually it would have taken place without marine renewables. So, you know, is there new community infrastructure that's being built because of marine renewables, or would it have happened otherwise? Quite an interesting debate there and research to be had. Also, there's the risk of community concerns. When we were in Orkney for the workshop, this is a picture of the art gallery, and you've got the manager of the art gallery who was telling us all about the development of a pontoon for to support the offshore marine renewables industry, and concerns about its location, its effect on the environment. And when I was there last time, they were busy building this this pontoon, obviously to support investment in the industry. But it raises questions. If this is receiving, for example, public money, is this money well spent? We see this predicted rapid growth of the industry, but what happens if we have blips in the system? Could this money potentially be spent better elsewhere? We're getting a lot of public investment. There's a lot of concern. In the last week or two, there's been a lot of discussion. We're suffering from austerity. There's concerns about lack of public spending cuts within local authorities. Should local authorities be investing in some of these big bits of infrastructure to support the marine renewables sector, given some of the uncertainty? So some big challenges. So should they maybe be spending it on other things to support the community? Some of the findings from response is also highlighting potential for quite significant industry and community tensions. You've got new marine renewable developers moving into areas where, as the previous two talks have mentioned, you've got historical users of the sea. You can see in the first quote talk about fishermen, and this was coming from a wave developer. The guy there is very aggressive. He's basically saying, if you come anywhere near any of my fishing rods that my guys catch, if you threaten my business in any way, I'm taking you to court. So you're starting to get animosity maybe between different sectors of the community, and tensions building. Similarly, you've got the stronger quote below. The same organisation spent a lot of time consulting on its consenting application, and then when he actually put it into for consenting, you then suddenly get quotes like "the bastards are trying to stop us from earning a living." So potential for community tensions there. Well, one of the things I'm interested in is some of the commercial reality of this, and we have to kind of step back. There's been the two previous talks talking about rights and community payments, but in reality these are commercial companies. Talking to them, most of them have 6-monthly financial kind of outlook. Every 6 months they're going back to investors, they're trying to get funding. It's pretty hand to mouth, as we'll come on to in a minute. And if communities start kicking up a fuss, they don't necessarily have to stay within those communities. So I'm thinking of Sandy's Carl Ray example, and we know one company that did actually move elsewhere after having delays, so it took its investment overseas. So there are potential challenges there. And there's also this is a good quote because it kind of sums up some of my thought on community payments. Why should marine renewables be providing community payments when things like nuclear power stations, road developments, for example, might not be? And you can see here the quote here from this particular developer that's saying, well, the nuclear power, they're not giving millions of pounds to the local community. DRACs aren't giving anything to the community. Yet renewables, everybody expects that when they turn up, it's a big payday. There are big utilities behind them. And I was going to talk about some of the recent, in the last week or so, there's a lot on community payments around shale gas and fracking, and whether there's some research there that needs to be done. But one of the things that really interests me, and that's really come to a fore in the last week or two, particularly around community burden, and you can imagine there's all this development going on, building of pontoons, building of new schools. There's this big hope for 1,600 devices on the seabed, lots of inward investment, but there's lots of industry uncertainty. And I was quite shocked on Friday to see that Pelamis Wave Power has been put into administration. A bit of background, the company I work for in offshore wind went into administration, and it's not a nice process, as I'll talk about in a minute. So that was Friday, and then I was even more surprised to see 24th, Siemens is going to abandon its tidal development, with potentially jobs being lost. So all that MCT development. So this then brings me on to how will this then affect these communities? You can see here KPMG have laid off 3/4 of the staff at Pelamis, which I should imagine might include those who have maybe bought new houses, moved into Orkney. All that development for support pontoons, EMEC development there's been a lot of investment in those communities, and now you can imagine EMEC as potentially losing 2 of its big clients. The other thing I would say is that there's potentially huge issues for local businesses. If a company goes into administration, it's very likely that many of its creditors will receive no money in return. So the company I work for, there were small businesses in some areas that lost tens of thousands of pounds, and you can imagine if they're very small businesses, that could really damage them quite terminally, in fact. So that's that. More widely, though, it's actually raised some bigger issues. So this is just a screenshot from the Herald Scotland, and you can see that it's received, Pelamis has received £15 million worth of funding from the Scottish Government, and already questions are being raised. So £12.9 million of investment in the form of grants, equity and loans from Scottish Enterprise, and also £2.5 million for renewables commercialisation. Now the company has been put into administration. So already you're starting to see some tensions, not necessarily within the community in Orkney, but more widely. These are just some responses on one or two of the news websites. You can see here there's comments about Alex Salmond, £18 million of investment that he's chucked in the ocean for no return. There was all this talk at the time of 16,000 green jobs, Palamis being groundbreaking, and now they're in administration. Similarly, the political side of this as well, Response has actually thrown up lots of really interesting snippets regarding the politics behind wave and tidal developments. But again, here you can see people being pretty upset, and also the kind of skepticism that we should have seen this happening. It will never be financially viable. It's too bad that Scottish enterprise has more money than sense, and it really starts to raise concerns about some of the investment that's gone on, and whether there it might lead to a kind of a bit of a black hole in some of these communities, and also with technology. So are we going to lose our technology lead? Is the IP going to be bought out by overseas companies? Will places like Stromness actually see any benefits? So that's it from me, really. I'm hoping to stimulate a bit of discussion. And in my view, there's an urgent need for research. There's lots of exciting research opportunities, particularly around longitudinal studies and seeing what's happening. So I'll pass it back to Sandy. Hello, Sandy.
Yeah, that's great, Simon. That's really lots to talk about there. And I think Glenn was first to put his hand up, metaphorically. So, Glenn, you got a question for Simon? I certainly have, but we're starting to queue up the questions. But Glenn first.
Can you take yourself off mute, Glenn?
Yep, I'm here. Yeah, actually, there wasn't really so much a question, just a quick couple of thoughts. One was what Simon mentioned about looking at sort of issues of rights and sort of talking about that almost ahead of time. And actually, my perspective on this comes from the technological perspective, in that my research was structured around sort of facilitating development of the industry. And I see this as more an impediment because they don't have the strong sort of claim to legal rights. Obviously, when you have a seabed lease or whatever, you do start to get this come up. But really, the perspective for me is, how do you stop this becoming an issue for them, coming from other people? And the only other thing, I just thought I'd mention one other example which happened a few months ago, maybe 6 months ago in Australia. One of Australia's leading sort of technology developers, Ocean Links, went bankrupt. And one of their devices is now stranded. It's this huge, great oscillating water column device off a beach. And now that's stranded there. There's no decommissioning plan. They've been promising for 2 years to get rid of it. And now the company's gone bankrupt, and the government sort of lumped with that. And exactly the same sorts of comments started coming out, as you mentioned. They got government funding, and that's just down the drain. And now we're stuck with this big device. And the final point I was going to make, and actually this Ocean Links device is in the sea, and all the photos you see are in this beautiful blue water, but actually right behind on the shore is a huge coal shipping terminal. And that leads me to the point, which is, I actually think marine renewables and renewables more generally are subject to a much higher standard of regulation in almost all aspects, and the community benefit is just one of them. Of course, environmental impact assessment is another, where because of uncertainty and a sort of risk aversion of regulators, we really put huge requirements even for the smallest of test devices. And yet with oil and gas, despite the fact that we know it's hugely damaging, because we know the impacts, we just sort of let it go ahead. And I'm not aware of any time an environmental impact assessment has ever stopped a project going ahead, but I think the threshold for marine renewables is so much higher. Just a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, in relation to that latter point, in the Response project, we got tons of information, lots of very detailed insights into exactly how this is posing such huge challenge, proportionality, small tidal test sites being treated in the same manner as huge offshore wind farms. Some of the stories that we've heard about EIAs, blanket consenting, that sort of thing, will just absolute. Some of the stories that we've heard are pretty outrageous. The point about what happens if a company fails, and your example in Australia, I had a conversation as part of response with a seabed leaseor, and I actually asked them, how would you respond if a device started mincing seals or a company failed? And they, at this point they don't really have answers. But that and decommissioning is potentially a huge issue. What happens if this stuff gets, if it just doesn't work, it fails? Who deals with the cleanup costs? So I'd be interested to have a chat with you at another point about this.
There's so many. Jordan's got a question at the moment. I just want to sort of interject for one just on the Orkney thing and recent developments. There's so many things, good points in your talk, Simon, but I think what's interesting is that if you look at in history, any technology that's come along, a new technology, there's been winners and lots of losers straight away. Even the oil industry, when it started, there was companies springing up and going bust. Until regularly in the IT sector was exactly the same when it started to develop. And I think part of the problem is that the first guys in the water, Palamas is first into the water, it's not necessarily the right technology. But then there's a political situation where political capital has been invested and you're throwing good money. Well, I'm not saying it's bad technology, but the potential to throw good money after bad. And then, because one company fails, or a couple of technologies fail, then the whole thing's deemed as hopeless. On the other hand, I know that Scott Renewables are there. They're getting a 2 megawatt device built right now in Northern Ireland. They are very confident that their levelized cost of energy is right down at where onshore wind is, and they're very confident that they've got a winning technology. And Maygen's going ahead, so there's going to be lots of charm and tension in there. There are a whole host of other things I'd like to pick up on. However, I would like to take advantage of the technology and broaden things out a little. So I've got Jordan, I believe, wants to ask a question. Jordan, are you able to?
Jordan,
Yes, sorry. I just have to find it again. Wrote it down. Right. During your presentation, you focused mainly on the, monetary benefits. Has there been any consideration by anyone out there right now about non-monetary benefits like energy security? Because a lot of these regions are off-grid where this resource is. So there is benefits to not having to bring in diesel or coal in more expensive fashions. Has anyone been working on that?
It's certainly Orkney is on grid, and it's a good point you make, because there is most of the work that's been done today in development interest and the business interest has been in large scale stuff, and it is about feeding into the national grid, and it's not about, the story by and large is not about communities becoming energy independent. There is, however, one development up in Shetland, at Blue Mill Sound, and I forget the name of the technology that's gone in it, but it's quite a small sort of tidal device, and that's really more sort of geared at local use. So there might be a sort of different market or sort of driver there, but very much at the moment it is about large scale. I'm just going to draw Kate in because I think she wants to talk about that point before we go on to somebody else. But Kate.
Okay, very quickly. Jordan, that's exactly the point that I wanted to bring in, which is the developmental possibilities of marine renewables for peripheral communities, island communities. I think the Shetland project, which Sandy talked about, is interesting because we've seen with onshore wind has made a real difference to some communities on the periphery who've actually been able to become involved by being part owners or owners of onshore wind turbines. And is that something that could work in the marine environment, which is so much more difficult to operate in. So the Shetland one is interesting from that point. It's Nova Innovation is the company, is the technology. It's very small. It's 30 kilowatts, and they've got 1 kilowatt worth of cable, but it's very much geared to local use. You know, this is for local housing and for local aquaculture and industry. Yeah, I'd like to see much more on how that can be developed.
I've got some people sort of stacking up for questions. I think, Simon, if you want to, if your comment is relevant to this discussion, we can bring it in now, and then I'll go back to Glenn Smith, who has a question. So, Simon, did you have something linked to this?
Yeah, I was just going to say that one of the issues I believe with Orkney, and Sandy might clarify this, is that there's already a lot of significant amount of community wind generation. So they see potentially no benefit from the marine renewables development. The other comment I was going to make is that there are companies developing, like Kate was saying, small tidal devices for estuarine locations and that sort of thing that we know of. There's one based in Cambridge.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a fair point you make about community scale development. If you're going to do it, to my mind, stick up a wind turbine. It works. It's easier. And that's a big question I have over community scale, small scale tidal. Even if you can get the technology to work, the locations are going to be so limited where you have community close to tidal resource, and then you've always got the option of putting up a wind turbine. So if you're going to have community investment, to my mind, it's always where it would be driven. And you're right in that the wave and tidal that's happening here is the interests are large scale commercial, and it's dislocated to a certain extent from the sort of community scale renewable energy development, of which there is a lot in Orkney. I suppose having that does create a general awareness about renewable energy here that maybe isn't the case in other places. Right, just so we can spread this discussion around a bit, I know Laura had a question there, but I spotted Glenn Smith wants to ask a question. So Laura, if you can hold on, just so we can introduce sort of some different voices. If Glenn, if you've got a question for somebody.
I do have one for yourself and one for Glenn actually as well. They're both these questions require some more background knowledge that perhaps people who are not familiar with Orkney or Scotland or the UK in general wouldn't be able to follow. But so feel free to get back to me afterwards as well. The one to you, Sandy, is regarding the role of the Crown Estate, which didn't get a big mention in your presentation. And I was wondering if there are is there any potential in Orkney for local management agreements under the Crown Estate?
Well, the Crown Estate position is very interesting. For those of you who don't know, the Crown Estate own the seabed is in a form of public ownership, and the Crown Estate Commission manage it. They sometimes like to imply that they own it. They don't, but they manage it, and there's legislation that means they're obliged to achieve as high a return as they can from that. Now, the Crown Estate's sort of basically coming in for a kicking from all directions in the past few years. It's tried to sort of step back. It's interesting to look back at aquaculture development, because it was the last sort of major marine new stuff to happen in the marine environment in Scotland. And Crown Estate tried to be planner and landlord at the same time, and it didn't work. And they really got a sort of hard time in the early 90s about that. And they stepped aside and said, well, planning decisions can go to local authorities and we'll just rent it. So if it gets planning permission, we'll rent it. And that was very much their position. And it was strange when marine renewables came along, the Crown Estate sort of dived in again and started to play it being planner as well as landlord, and you can't be both. There is a conflict of interest, or at least there's a perception of a conflict, and that's almost as bad. So they've kind of got themselves in a mess again, and certainly there was about 2 years ago, there was a House of Commons Scottish Affairs Select Committee, and that's House of Commons, not Edinburgh, recommended that Crown Estate be disbanded. The whole thing got caught up in the devolution, the independence debate and referendum that we've just had, and it was kind of putting up as a token that if we go for independence, the Crown Estate will get disbanded. But I think it's going to happen anyway, because nobody's going to stick up for them. They're not popular, and then it's a question of what you put in place, whether it. And I think you are probably looking at some regional kind of planning control, or regional. And the rent's coming back regionally, but it's not clear yet. I think Kate wants to jump in.
Can I just say something very quickly on that, because it's absolutely of today, because we have published this morning the new Scottish devolution settlement, and the ownership and control of the seabed is a key part of that. So I'm very keen tonight actually to see what has come out in the announcement today as part of the new settlement. So we may well find that that will be devolved to Scotland.
Yeah, so that's it's very interesting times on this point. I'm scrolling about now. I realised I just bypassed Laura. Laura, have you got something you'd like to chip into the conversation?
No, I'd actually prefer to save it until the next meeting and hear from other people.
Okay. That's fine. That's good. And I'm scrolling down. Sorry. And I think Simon, did you have a comment, or was that just what you typed there?
No comment.
Okay. And is there anybody else out there that's got anything that they would, if you want to step in, just say?
I did have a follow-up question for Glenn as well, but perhaps I can just...
No, go for it, Glenn, it's fine.
It was just regarding UDL law in Orkney, because I'm struggling to find a place in how the old sort of Norse-related laws and some of the loopholes fit into some of these issues. I'm struggling to clarify that with sources online, but I think that's probably another bigger discussion that I can ask.
Glenn, you got any comments on UDL law?
No, none whatsoever. I have to say, Sandy is perhaps my understanding is that UDL law doesn't have much impact at all practically on the marine renewables and sort of rights question, but I may be very wrong on that. It's been some time since I looked into it, but for me it was just a bit of a black hole that.
Right.
Yeah, it is. Wow, it's very difficult to get any authoritative source on UDL law at all. The
reason I bring it up is because it does stipulate ownership of the foreshore.
Yes, that's a point I was going to make, because the foreshore in most of the rest of the UK, most of it, not all of it, is owned by the Crown. It's part of the Crown Estate. In Orkney, the tradition is that UDL law means that private ownership extends down to the low water mark, I believe. And actually, there was a case recently in Orkney, it had nothing to do with marine renewables, but that actually established that was the case. So there was a piece of case law. I can't quite remember when it was, but just in the past couple of years. So in terms of sort of foreshore, yeah, it might be significant.
Yeah.
Now, I see that I have Carly's there and would like to ask a question, so if you can open your mic up, Carly, that would be great.
Yeah, so it's mainly for you, Sandy, but maybe other people can comment too. It's around, you've mentioned conflict of interest there, and I wonder about the payments in the wind sector to authorities that are also controlling planning, whether you know anything about whether that was perceived as a conflict of interest, and if you kind of think that plays out for marine renewables in any particular way.
Well, I suppose that there's a couple of things there. With the onshore wind, I mean, these payments are happening. They are described as goodwill payments, but I think everybody recognises, and there's a little bit of research around this as well, as I forget the first name, Aitken from Karen Aitken from Edinburgh University done some interview research, and it's quite clear that while officially they're goodwill payments, there is a recognition that local communities can bring pressure to bear on a local planning system in a way that they can't in the marine environment. Therefore, if money's coming back, it's seen to, well, this is why developers are, it's obviously clearly a motivation for developers making the payment. I suppose that in terms of the conflict of interest, that the money isn't going to the local authority directly. It's getting channeled through the local authority often acts as a broker. So they'll take the funds and then they get distributed to the local community. The huge problem they've had is actually defining what on earth is the local community. You know, how do you ring fence it? And that's been a significant significant problem. So it's a fair point you make, and it's not one that I'm aware of anything being specifically written about. And it was certainly the case with the Crown Estate and aquaculture that they got themselves in a right mess, because they couldn't be, even if they tried to be fair when they made decisions, they were perceived as being the people who are taking the money. So why should they make planning decisions on behalf of the public good when they're making money from it? So I suppose you're right. There's a strong element of that conflict there.
It links to the idea of whether there's a homogenous view in the community or whether there are multiple communities, some of which might be supportive and be kind of enthused by the idea of community payments, whereas those who maybe feel that that it's not a good idea, it's like the decision-making bodies being bought out or have their head turned by funds. So there's something quite interesting there, I think.
That's absolutely the case, and it would be wrong, and it's very easy to I've talked about development trusts and so on, and say, well, they're driving, trying to get payments back, but there's a myriad of voices within those organisations, and there's always questions about the legitimacy of these organisations. That the development trust movement has really been pushed in Scotland. There's been a lot of public and government support for it, but you always ask the question, well, whose voices are being heard? I mean, they're not democratic. It's kind of whoever turns up at the village hall becomes the voice of the community. So there's a potentially a democratic deficit there. Very interesting. Right. I'm lost track of who's. So. Yeah. Sorry, Simon. Are you wanting to jump in again, or?
No, it's a comment.
Just a comment.
I was just trying to make a comment that some of the points that Carly raised were certainly in the news last week regarding INEOS's proposed shale gas investment and community payments. So if anybody's interested in the kind of I suppose moral aspects of it, have a look on the BBC News, because there was lots of coverage last week.
I mean, this whole issue of community payments is fascinating, and you raised the point, and I'd actually read it down as a question before you raised it, but why on earth do we assume there's this assumption with renewable energy that it should happen? I think in some parts of Scotland, and particularly in the west coast at Kyle-Rea, there's you've got a cultural historic context that's important of absentee landowners who are perceived as sort of coming in and taking resources from the community, and maybe renewable energy developers are seen in that light, which kind of create that response. But nonetheless, it's interesting. We don't sort of routinely ask for, somebody's building a factory or a house or, whatever, ask for sort of community payments. But this is something that's not, it's not just sort of limited to the UK. And I was talking to somebody from South Africa recently about large solar arrays there, and there's all sorts of, community payments have to be built into the project plan, as do sort of other restrictions over the requirements over the ethnicity of the board of the company. So there's a lot of really interesting things there. Right, now we're going to, I just
a comment.
Yeah, I think that was a comment from Becky there. I notice it's got some interesting discussion going there. However, it's past 5:30. I think that more comments coming through. That Laura wants to sort of step in and say a word. Am I right, Laura, about the next next event?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to remind everyone that this is the first of 3 events, and that we're having a second event following up on this one, which will be on the 16th of December, which everyone is very welcome to attend. And it's going to be focused around, we're calling it focus around consultation, but we're thinking of that in a broad sense of both consultation and communication. I'll be talking about a recent project I did called an energy walk, which is happening at the Danish Wave Energy Centre. And Bauke is also going to be speaking. And we also have one spare slot. It's your only chance if you want to present or raise an issue with everyone online next session. So please get in touch with me if you'd like to talk. We do have one free slot. And then we're going to have a third session in January as well. So I'm hoping everyone will be able to join us in December in a few weeks. So that's all I have to say for that. Sandy, I hand back to you.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm not going to draw this out any longer, but I think it's been a bit of a learning experience doing this. It's the first time we tried to run one of these, but the technologies sort of hang together quite well. I find that really interesting, and I'd have actually liked some longer to have some more discussion, but it's actually quite good to stop things, not when they're fizzling out, but when the discussion's been good. So I think that's worked quite well. As Laura said, the next meeting's going to look at a consultation process and a community consultation, and then in the new year we're going to have a meeting more specifically on marine spatial planning. I think at the last meeting we'll try and take a little bit of time to reflect on these 3 webinars and whether we found it interesting. It doesn't seem to be too difficult to do. It's a way that we can stay together and get some discussion going, and maybe have a little bit of a think at that meeting about what we do with ISSMER and pushing it forward. So it just falls to me to say to everybody, well, thank you very much for your time and your comments.
And I was just saying, could Glenn, right, you said you just wanted to have make a quick announcement before we go?
Yeah, Glenn, on you go.
Yeah, sorry, it was just a quick announcement, a quick plug. We're currently, a few of us, working on a paper that's a research agenda, a legal research agenda to accompany the social sciences one that was published. We're sort of quite a way through that, but if anyone wants to be involved, the second draft should be out fairly soon. And that will be published hopefully in Energy Policy as a sort of accompaniment. So, yep, just that was all. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks for that, Glenn. So, thanks everybody. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it stimulated some thought. It certainly has for me, and as I say, I could have gone on a bit longer, but that means I think we can do it again. So, goodbye from Orkney, and thank you, and good evening. Goodbye.